The Dakota Territory, 1875. It was a land of staggering beauty and unforgiving cruelty. A place where a single sunset could paint the sky with God's own fire, and a single gunshot could extinguish a life in a heartbeat. This isn't a story about famous gunslingers or legendary lawmen. It's about a lone woman, a forgotten promise, and a debt of blood paid not with violence, but with a vow. It's the story of how one act of quiet courage in a secluded cabin forged an alliance that defied a world determined to tear itself apart, and how that protection became both a shield and a cage. The wind in the Black Hills of Dakota had a voice. Most settlers, fresh from the tamed fields of Ohio or the crowded streets of New York, heard only a lonesome howl that rattled their cabin walls and frayed their nerves. But Emma Jane Thompson, who had lived on her solitary homestead for 3 years since the fever took her husband, Dr. Samuel Thompson, had learned its language. She could hear the promise of rain in its low murmur through the pines, the bite of a coming frost in its sharp whistle across the plains, and on this particular afternoon, she heard something new. It was a sound of distress, a frantic, rhythmic sigh that was not the wind at all. Her homestead was a precarious island in a vast, disputed sea. To the east lay the burgeoning, mud-choked streets of settlements like Custer City, filled with gold-crazed prospectors and nervous merchants. To the west and all around her were the Paha Sapa, the sacred hills of the Lakota Sioux, a people who had seen the recent Treaty of Fort Laramie betrayed by the very men who had signed it. Samuel had chosen this spot for its isolation, for the clean air he believed would fortify their lungs. Instead, it had become Emma's legacy, a 160-acre testament to a love cut short. She stood on her porch, a tall, slender woman of 30, her face etched with a premature severity that belied the softness in her grey eyes. Her hands, though calloused from chopping wood and tending her garden, were uncannily steady, a trait she'd inherited from her father, a watchmaker, and honed by 3 years of assisting her doctor husband. There it was again. A strained, guttural sound carried on the breeze from the direction of the creek that marked the southern edge of her property. It wasn't an animal. She'd learned the cries of the cougar, the bark of the coyote, the bugle of the elk. This was human. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. Her first instinct was to bar the door and load the double-barreled shotgun Samuel had insisted she learn to use. A lone woman was a target for all kinds of predators in this land, and not all of them walked on 4 legs. But another instinct, deeper and more insistent, warred with the first. It was the physician's instinct drilled into her by Samuel. "You don't ask who they are, Emma," he used to say, his hands stained with blood as he worked. "You ask where it hurts." She grabbed the leather medical satchel from its hook by the door. It was still stocked with Samuel's tools, gleaming scalpels, forceps, needles, and spools of catgut alongside her own additions of dried yarrow for staunching blood and willow bark for pain. Tucking a Colt peacemaker into the waistband of her canvas skirt, she descended the porch steps, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The walk to the creek was a descent into shadow. The tall ponderosa pines blocked out the late afternoon sun, and the air grew cool and damp. The sound grew clearer now, a low, pained groan. As she pushed aside a curtain of wild willow, she saw him. He was Sioux. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the long black hair matted with sweat and dirt, or the buckskin leggings. He was young, no older than 20, his face a mask of agony. He was lying on his side, his back pressed against a large granite boulder, his hands clenched around his right thigh, where blood dark and viscous had soaked through the leather and pooled on the pine needles below. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. Beside him lay a bow and a quiver of arrows, one of which was snapped in two. Emma froze. This was not just an injured man. This was a political statement. He was a Sioux warrior, found bleeding on land the United States government had illegally opened to settlers. Helping him could be seen as treason by her own people. The prospectors and soldiers who passed through these parts spoke of the Sioux with a venomous mix of fear and hatred. To be branded an Indian lover was a social death sentence, if not a literal one. She could turn back now. No one would ever know. He would bleed out by the creek, and the wind would be the only witness. She took a step back, her hand hovering near the grip of the peacemaker. Then the man's eyes flickered open. They were dark, clouded with pain, but for a fleeting second, they focused on her. There was no hate in them, no malice, only a desperate, primal plea for life. In that instant, he was not a warrior, not an enemy. He was simply a dying boy, miles from his people, bleeding out on cold ground. Samuel's voice echoed in her mind, clear as the day he'd last spoken it. "Where does it hurt?" "Damn it all to hell, Samuel," she whispered to the ghost of her husband. She knelt beside the young man, her fear receding, replaced by a clinical focus. "It's all right," she said softly, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he would understand the tone. "I'm here to help. Don't you move." His eyes widened slightly as she reached for his leg, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. He flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy," she murmured, holding her hands up, palms open to show she meant no harm. She pointed to the medical satchel, then to his wound. "Medicine," she said, tapping her chest. "Doctor." He watched her, his gaze sharp and intelligent, despite the pain. He seemed to be weighing his options, a quick death alone, or a potential one at the hands of this strange white woman. After a long moment, a barely perceptible nod was his answer. The first task was to see the wound. The buckskin was thick and stiff with drying blood. Cutting it away would be the only way. She pulled a pair of heavy shears from the satchel. The sight of the steel made him tense again. "Shh," she soothed. "Just the cloth, just the leggings." She made a snipping motion in the air before gently touching the shears to the material well away from his skin. He watched her every move as she carefully cut a line up his thigh, the tough leather parting with a series of loud snips. When the wound was exposed, Emma had to stifle a gasp. It was a bullet hole, a big one. The entry point on the front of his thigh was a ragged, dark circle. But the real damage was on the back, where the lead had torn its way out, leaving a gaping crater of shredded muscle and splintered bone. It was a miracle he hadn't bled to death already. It looked like a slug from a Sharps rifle, the kind used by the buffalo hunters who were systematically destroying the Sioux's way of life. He wouldn't survive the night out here. Infection, blood loss, or a predator would claim him. Moving him was a terrible risk, but leaving him was certain death. She had to get him to the cabin. "We have to move," she said, more to herself than to him. "Can you stand?" She mimed the motion of standing up. He tried pushing himself up with his arms, but a searing wave of pain shot through him, and he collapsed back with a sharp cry, his face pale and beaded with sweat. There was only one way. Emma was strong for her size, hardened by homestead life, But the man, though lean, was solid muscle. She positioned herself at his back, looping her arms under his, and prepared for the deadening weight. "On 3, she grunted, as if he could understand. 1, 2, 3. With a cry of exertion, she heaved him upright. He screamed a raw, piercing sound that was swallowed by the forest. He tried to put weight on his good leg, but he was dizzy and weak. It became a half-drag, half-carry, a torturous shuffle through the woods. Every few feet, they had to stop, both of them gasping for breath. His blood left a trail on the forest floor, a crimson path leading directly to her front door. It was a trail that anyone could follow. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was a dying ember on the horizon, and Emma's muscles burned with a fire that almost matched the pain in his leg. She maneuvered him through the doorway and onto the bearskin rug in front of the cold hearth, his body slumping to the floor in a dead faint. For a moment she stood over him, chest heaving, her dress stained with his blood. The sheer terrifying reality of what she had done crashed down on her. A Sioux warrior lay bleeding in her home. A trail of blood led from the creek to her doorstep. In a land where suspicion was a currency and violence a daily transaction, she had just signed a warrant for her own destruction. She locked the door, slid the heavy bar across it, and covered the windows with thick blankets. Then, lighting a lantern, she turned back to the unconscious man, the physician's daughter taking over once more. The world outside, with its politics and its hatred, would have to wait. Tonight, her world was this small cabin, and her only purpose was to fight the death that was already seeping into its floorboards. The night was a long, bloody battle fought by the flickering light of a single kerosene lantern. Emma worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her mind a whirlwind of Samuel's lessons. First, she needed to stop the bleeding and clean the wound. She heated water on the cast-iron stove, infusing it with calendula and the precious salt she usually reserved for curing meat. The young warrior remained unconscious, his breathing a shallow whisper. As she washed the grime and congealed blood from his leg, she could see the full extent of the damage. The bullet had shattered his femur. It wasn't a clean break. The bone was splintered with sharp fragments protruding into the surrounding muscle tissue. "God help us," she breathed. Setting a bone like this was far beyond her experience. Samuel had done it, his strong hands manipulating limbs with a confidence she could only dream of. Now it was up to her. She found Samuel's laudanum, a tincture of opium, and forced a few drops between the man's lips, hoping to keep him insensate. Then she retrieved the wooden splints and linen bandages. Gritting her teeth, she took a deep breath and grasped his lower leg. She pulled. A guttural sound of pure agony escaped the man's lips, even in his stupor. His back arched off the floor. Emma felt a sickening grind as the bone fragments shifted. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes. She pulled again, harder this time, trying to align the two main pieces of the femur, her own muscles screaming in protest. It was like trying to mend a broken tree branch. She worked by feel, her fingers probing the mangled flesh, trying to push the larger fragments back into place. Finally, with a soft, wet click, she felt the bones align as best she could. She didn't dare let go. Holding the leg in place with one hand, she skillfully wrapped the splints with the other, binding them tight with linen strips until his leg was immobilized from hip to ankle. The crisis of the break was over, but the threat of infection had just begun. The exit wound was a mess. Using forceps sterilized in the flame of the lantern, she began the painstaking work of debridement, picking out tiny pieces of lead, shattered bone, and bits of buckskin that had been driven deep into the tissue. Each piece she removed was a small victory against the gangrene that would surely follow. Finally, she packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and crushed garlic, a potent combination Samuel had sworn by, and bandaged it tightly. Exhausted, she sank back on her heels. The floor around her was a tableau of their struggle, bloody rags, discarded bits of tissue, and a bowl of pink water. The warrior's breathing was deeper now, more regular. His fever was high, but he was stable. He was alive. She spent the rest of the night watching him dozing fitfully in a chair with the shotgun across her lap. At some point near midnight, he awoke. His eyes clear of the fog of shock fixed on her. He looked at his splintered leg, then back at her. He said something in his own tongue, the words soft and questioning. Emma shook her head. "I don't understand." "My name is Emma," she pointed to herself. "Emma." He watched her lips, then repeated the sound, his pronunciation surprisingly close. "Eliza." He then tapped his own chest. "Chayton." "Chayton," she repeated. The name felt solid, like a stone. It was the first bridge across the chasm that separated their worlds. For the next 2 days, a strange, silent routine developed. Emma would tend to his wound, forcing broth and willow bark tea down his throat to fight the fever and pain. Chayton, though weak and immobile, watched her with an unnerving intensity. He watched how she stoked the fire, how she kneaded bread, how she spoke to herself in quiet, worried whispers. They communicated with gestures. He would point to the water bucket when he was thirsty, or touch his bandages when the pain flared. She in turn learned the Lakota word for water memne and for pain tehanyanka. They were two people from warring nations trapped in a bubble of shared humanity, the cabin walls holding the hostile world at bay. The quiet, however, was shattered on the 3rd morning. It was the sound of hoofbeats that alerted her, confident and steady, not the cautious tread of a deer, and more than one horse. Emma's blood ran cold. She rushed to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the blanket. 3 men were riding up the path to her cabin. The man in the lead was unmistakable. Roman Fletcher. Fletcher was a man who had built a small empire of fear in the territory. He'd been a buffalo hunter, a scout for the army, and now owned a large, undefined tract of land that bordered hers to the east. He claimed it was for ranching, but everyone knew he made his money through less savory means, selling whiskey to miners, cheating prospectors, and it was rumored rustling cattle. He was handsome in a cruel, predatory way, with pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a smile that never reached them. He had made advances toward Emma once, a few months after Samuel died, suggesting a merger of their properties. She had refused him flatly, and his smile had turned venomous. He hadn't bothered her since, but she knew men like Fletcher didn't forget a slight. "Chayton," she hissed, turning from the window. "You have to be quiet, utterly silent. Do you understand? Kete kill," she said, making a throat-slitting gesture. "Bad men." His eyes, which had been growing accustomed to seeing her as a healer, hardened instantly. He understood. With a grimace of pain, he reached for the small knife that was still sheathed at his belt, the one Emma hadn't had the heart to take from him. He nodded, his jaw set. A heavy fist pounded on the door. "Mrs. Thompson. Emma Jane. You in there? It's Roman Fletcher, just paying a neighborly call." Emma took a deep breath, schooling her features into a mask of placid neutrality. She hid Chayton's knife under the edge of the bearskin rug and placed a quilt over his lower body, covering the splint. She moved the shotgun out of sight, but kept the peacemaker tucked in her skirt. "Just a moment, Mr. Fletcher," she called out, her voice higher than she would have liked. She unbarred the door and opened it just a crack, blocking the view inside with her body. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Fletcher tipped his hat, his smile as slick as snake oil. "Just checking on my favorite neighbor. A man gets worried about a lady all alone out here. Heard a bit of a commotion down by the creek a couple days back. Sounded like a gunshot, maybe a man hollering. Figured I'd make sure you were all right." His eyes weren't on her face. They were trying to peer past her into the dim cabin. The other two men, rough-looking characters with rifles resting on their saddles, stayed back, their gazes sweeping the property. "I'm quite fine, thank you," Emma said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "Must have been a cougar. I heard it myself. They can sound remarkably human when they're in distress." Fletcher's smile widened. "A cougar. Is that right, Funny? I was tracking a different kind of animal. A red-skinned one. Winged him good with my sharps down by the creek, but the slippery devil got away. Left a blood trail a blind man could follow. Trail seemed to peter out right around here. You ain't seen a stray Sioux boy limping around, have you? Got a big hole in his leg." The casual cruelty in his voice made Emma's stomach churn. He was the one. He had shot Chayton from ambush like a dog. Her hand instinctively went to the pistol at her waist. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm, "I have spent the last 3 years of my life on this land. I have seen things that would turn your stomach, but I have never not once seen a Sioux on my property. If I did, you can be sure my shotgun would have something to say about it before you ever did." It was a convincing lie, steeped in the bigotry he expected to hear. Fletcher studied her face, his pale eyes searching for any flicker of deceit. For a terrible second, she thought he saw it. "Is that so?" he said slowly. "Mind if I come in for a drink of water? The trail has made me mighty thirsty." It wasn't a request. This was the moment of truth. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. To let him in could mean death for them both. "Of course," she said, stepping back and opening the door wider. "Hospitality is one of the few luxuries I can still afford." She turned her back on him to get a cup from the shelf, a calculated risk. It made her vulnerable, but it also projected a confidence she hoped would disarm him. The cabin was small. He would see Chayton on the floor in a moment. Fletcher stepped inside, his boots loud on the wooden planks. His eyes immediately fell on the form under the quilt. "Well, now what's this you got, company?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "My cousin's boy," Emma said, without turning around. Her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Came down with a terrible fever on the trail from Laramie. I'm trying to sweat it out of him." Fletcher walked slowly toward the hearth, his spurs jingling a deathly tune. He stood over Chayton, looking down. Chayton lay perfectly still. His eyes closed, his breathing shallow, feigning the deep sleep of the sick. Emma held her breath. The quilt covered the splint, but the shape was still odd. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of herbs and blood, a smell Fletcher might recognize. "He looks dark-complected for your kin." "Emma Jane," Fletcher said softly, his hand moving slowly toward the edge of the quilt. At that moment from outside, one of his men shouted, "Row, Mum!" "Over here, looks like that blood trail you was talking about." Picked it up again behind the woodpile. Emma had been so careful, but she must have dripped some blood when she'd gone for firewood. It was a fatal mistake. Fletcher's head snapped up. The pretense was over. His eyes now cold and hard as river stones locked with Emma's. "You lying bitch," he hissed. He lunged not for the quilt, but for her. The instant Fletcher moved, the cabin exploded into chaos. He was fast, his hunter's reflexes honed and deadly. He lunged for Emma, his hand clamping around her wrist with brutal force, twisting it until she cried out in pain. The cup she was holding clattered to the floor. "Should have known you was a squaw lover." He snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath foul with the smell of cheap whiskey. "After we deal with your redskin pet, you and I are gonna have a long talk." But he had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the man on the floor. With a roar that was pure primal fury, Chayton moved. Ignoring the agony in his leg, he threw off the quilt, revealing the splint and his sheathed knife. In one fluid motion, he drew the blade and swiped at Fletcher's legs. The knife wasn't long, but it was razor sharp. It sliced through Fletcher's trousers and deep into the flesh of his calf. Fletcher howled in pain and surprise, his grip on Emma loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening she needed. She stomped down hard on his instep with her boot heel, and as he flinched, she ripped her arm free, stumbling back toward the wall where the shotgun was hidden. Chayton tried to rise to press his attack, but his shattered leg gave way, and he fell back with a groan, his face contorting in a mask of fresh agony. Fletcher, enraged and bleeding, turned his attention back to the warrior. "You'll die for that, you filthy savage," he bellowed, drawing his own massive Bowie knife. He took a limping step toward the hearth, raising the blade to plunge it into Chayton's chest. "Fletcher!" Emma's voice was a crack of thunder. He froze and turned. She was standing by the fireplace, both barrels of the greener shotgun leveled directly at his heart. Her face was pale, but her hands were rock steady. The grey in her eyes had been replaced by chips of flint. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Fletcher stared at her, then at the twin black holes of the shotgun's muzzle. He was a bully, but not a fool. He knew a cornered woman with a shotgun was more dangerous than a grizzly. He slowly lowered his knife. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Emma Jane," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "This ain't over." "It is for today," she replied, not wavering. "Tell your men to back away from my home, now!" Fletcher backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving her. "Boys, mount up," he yelled over his shoulder. "We're leaving." He gave Emma one last look, a look that promised retribution, before slipping out the door. A moment later, she heard the sound of 3 horses galloping away at full speed. Only when the hoofbeats had faded completely did she allow herself to breathe. The shotgun suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and she leaned it against the wall, her legs threatening to buckle. She slid to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. Chayton was looking at her, his chest heaving. The fire of battle had faded from his eyes, replaced by something else. Something she had never seen there before, or... He spoke a single word in Lakota, his voice filled with reverence. "Wichasha Wakan." Later he would explain it meant holy woman or spirit woman. At that moment, all Emma knew was that something profound had just passed between them. A line had been crossed. She was no longer just his healer. She was his protector. And in doing so, she had declared war on men like Roman Fletcher. She crawled over to Chayton, her clinical focus returning. His wound had reopened from the violent movement, and fresh blood was staining the bandages. "You fool," she whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of anger and relief. "You magnificent fool. You could have torn your leg apart." She worked quickly to redress the wound, her hands still shaking. As she worked, he reached out and gently touched her hair, a gesture so unexpected and tender. It made her stop. He said nothing, but his eyes conveyed a depth of gratitude that transcended language. They knew Fletcher would be back. He wasn't a man to let such a humiliation go unanswered. He would come back with more men, and next time he wouldn't knock. They were living on borrowed time. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tense silence. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, Chayton grew agitated. He kept looking toward the west, a deep frown on his face. He grabbed Emma's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "They come," he said, using one of the few English words he knew. "They come." "Who, Fletcher?" she asked, her heart sinking. He shook his head, pointing west toward the heart of the Paha Sapa. "Lakota. My people." How could he possibly know he had sent no signal, no message? But he was certain. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, his back against the wall, and began to chant softly, a low, rhythmic prayer that filled the small cabin with a strange sense of solemnity. Emma didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. The arrival of the Sioux could mean rescue, or it could mean a bloodbath if Fletcher and his men returned at the same time. The night stretched before them, an abyss of uncertainty. She barred the door, loaded the shotgun again, and took up her vigil in the chair sitting opposite Chayton. Two warriors from different worlds, waiting for the dawn. The first hint of light, a pale grey line on the eastern horizon, brought with it a new sound. It wasn't the gallop of Fletcher's thugs. It was the soft, muffled tread of dozens of unshod ponies, a sound more felt than heard. Emma went to the window and peered out. Her breath caught in her throat. They were emerging from the pre-dawn mist like ghosts. A column of at least 30 Sioux warriors, silent and implacable, their faces painted for war. They were armed with bows, lances, and rifles. At their head rode a man who commanded authority without a word. He was older, his face a magnificent road map of sun and sorrow, his long hair streaked with grey. He wore a full eagle feather war bonnet, the trail of which flowed down his back, a symbol of immense prestige and respect. This was no mere war party. This was a chief. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin in a silent, menacing circle. They made no move to attack, simply sat on their ponies, watching, waiting. The sheer, silent power of their presence was more terrifying than any war cry. The cabin door creaked open. Chayton, using the wall and a piece of firewood as a crutch, had managed to pull himself to his feet. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the lantern light, and called out a single name. 8, Father. The chief's stoic expression broke, replaced by one of profound relief. He dismounted and strode toward the cabin, his warriors parting before him. He stopped before Chayton, placing his hands on his son's shoulders, his eyes scanning the crude splint and the pale, drawn face. He spoke in rapid Lakota, his voice a low rumble of questions and concern. Chayton replied, his voice weak but clear. He spoke for a long time, recounting the ambush, the pain, and his rescue. As he spoke, he gestured back into the cabin toward Emma, who stood frozen by the hearth, the shotgun still clutched in her hands. The chief's gaze followed his son's gesture, and for the first time he looked directly at Emma. His eyes were dark and piercing, as if they could see right through to her soul, weighing her every fear, every decision. He saw the blood on the floor, the medical supplies, the shotgun. He saw the defiance and the terror warring in her face. He stepped past his son and into the cabin. He was a tall man, and his presence seemed to suck all the air from the small room. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over her. His warriors just outside the door watched in absolute silence. The fate of the white woman, the Wasichuwian, now rested entirely in this man's hands. He could honor her for saving his son, or he could kill her for being one of the people who were destroying his world. The sun was rising, casting long golden shafts of light through the open door. A new day was breaking, but for Emma Jane Thompson, it felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. The chief stood before Emma, a mountain of silent judgment. His name was Tatanka Sapa Black Buffalo, a name known and feared by the U.S. Army and revered by the Oglala Lakota. He was a man who had seen more treaties broken than he could count, a man whose heart was heavy with the sorrow of his people. His gaze swept over Emma, taking in her disheveled hair, the bloodstains on her dress, and the shotgun she held with white-knuckled tension. He looked from her to his son, Chaitan, who leaned heavily in the doorway. He looked at the expertly crafted splint, the clean bandages, the herbs still sitting in a bowl. Then his eyes settled on the dark stain on the floor, where Fletcher's blood had mingled with Chaitan's. He saw not just a scene of healing, but one of conflict, of a stand being made. He spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that resonated with absolute authority. The words were in Lakota, directed at his son, but intended for the universe. Chaitan, still weak, translated his voice, gaining strength with each word. "My father asks, who did this to me?" Chaitan said, his eyes fixed on Emma. "A man named Roman Fletcher." She replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "He shot you from ambush. He came here looking for you. He would have killed us both." Chaitan relayed this to Black Buffalo. The chief's eyes narrowed, a cold fire burning within them. The name Fletcher was not unknown to him. It was a name whispered with contempt, associated with poisoned waterholes and the illegal trade of fire water that had ruined many young warriors. Black Buffalo then looked at the shotgun in Emma's hands. He spoke again. "He asks why you did not use this on me when I was brought here." Chaitan translated. Emma's throat was dry. How could she explain the war within herself? The memory of her husband, the flicker of humanity in a dying boy's eyes. "My husband was a doctor," she said finally, the words feeling small and inadequate. "He taught me that a person in need has no tribe. They are just a life waiting to be saved or lost. I chose to save." The translation was short, but its impact on Black Buffalo was visible. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. He took a step closer, and Emma flinched, her finger tightening on the trigger. He stopped, holding up a hand, palm open, in the universal sign of peace. He spoke to Chaitan, his voice softer this time. "My father says that in a world where your people see us only as beasts to be slaughtered." Chaitan translated his voice, thick with emotion. "You saw a human being. He says your husband's spirit is strong in this house." Black Buffalo then did something that stunned Emma. He reached up and with great reverence plucked a single perfect eagle feather from his war bonnet. It was a golden eagle tail feather, tipped in black, its base wrapped in red-dyed porcupine quills. It was not a mere decoration. It was a mark of honor, a symbol of great deeds, courage, and a direct connection to Wakan Tanka, the Great Spirit. He stepped forward again slowly and held it out to her. "He offers you this," said Chaitan. "It is a sign that you are a friend to the Oglala, that this house is a place of peace. Hesitantly, Emma lowered the shotgun and reached out her trembling fingers, taking the feather. It was lighter than air, yet it felt as heavy as a stone, a weight of significance she could barely comprehend. Black Buffalo was not finished. He turned and issued a sharp command to his warriors. 2 of them dismounted and came forward, their faces impassive. They entered the cabin, and with a gentleness that belied their fearsome appearance, they lifted Chaitin, improvising a litter from a blanket, and 2 strong branches they quickly found outside. They would carry him home. As they were about to leave, Black Buffalo turned back to Emma one last time. He placed his fist over his heart and began to speak, not in the conversational tone from before, but in the formal, solemn cadence of a sacred vow. His eyes never left hers. His voice rose and fell, filling the small cabin, spilling out into the dawn, a declaration for the hills and the sky to witness. Chaitin, his face a mask of awe, translated from the litter. I, Tatanka Sapa, chief of the Oglala Lakota, I vow this oath before the Great Spirit and the spirits of my ancestors. His voice grew stronger. The woman who lives on this ground, this woman with the spirit of a healer and the heart of a warrior, she is under my protection. He raised his hand, pointing to the 4 corners of her property. This land she calls her own, from the creek in the south to the ridge in the north, from the rising to the setting sun. This land is Wakan, it is sacred. It shall not be touched. My people will not hunt here. They will not set foot here with weapons unless it is to defend it. His gaze intensified, becoming a burning coal. Any man, be he white or Lakota, who comes to this place to bring harm to this woman, his enemy is not her alone. His enemy is me. His enemy is the Oglala. We will be the shadow that follows him. We will be the wind that whispers his name. We will be the arrow in the night. This I swear on the honor of my people. This protection is eternal. It will last until the grass no longer grows and the rivers no longer flow. He finished, his hand still held high. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the chirping of a morning bird. The weight of his words settled over the homestead, a powerful, invisible shield. He had not just offered protection, he had declared her small piece of land a sovereign nation under his care. Without another word, Black Buffalo turned and strode out of the cabin. He mounted his pony in a single fluid movement. He gave one last, long look at Emma, standing in her doorway, clutching the eagle feather. Then turned his horse west and led his people away, the silent procession melting back into the pines as mysteriously as it had arrived. Emma stood there for a long time, watching them go. The sun was fully up now, bathing the valley in a clean golden light. The world looked the same, but everything had changed. She looked down at the feather in her hand. It was a gift, a promise, an alliance sworn in blood and honor. She thought of Roman Fletcher. Let him come back. Let him bring 100 men. She was no longer a lone woman on a forgotten homestead. She was Emma Jane Thompson, friend to the Oglala, and her land was protected by the oath of a chief. She felt a surge of strength, of defiance. But as the initial elation faded, a cold sliver of apprehension crept in. This protection, this sacred vow, what would it cost her? She had been granted a shield against one enemy, but in doing so, she had drawn a line in the sand between herself and her own world. The oath of Black Buffalo was a shield. Yes. But she had a sinking feeling it would also become a cake. She went back inside, barred the door, and carefully placed the eagle feather on the mantel beside the tintype photograph of her late husband. His smiling face seemed to look at the feather, and for a moment she imagined he was nodding in approval. She had upheld his creed, but now she would have to live with the consequences alone in the vast, unforgiving wilderness between two warring worlds. The oath of Black Buffalo was not a loud, dramatic intervention. It was a quiet, pervasive presence, as subtle and as constant as the wind. In the weeks that followed, Emma saw no more of the Lakota. No warriors stood guard at her gate. No chief paid a social call, and yet she knew they were there. The first sign came a week after their departure. A fierce autumn storm blew through the hills, felling a massive pine tree that crushed a section of her fence and narrowly missed her goat pen. The next morning, as the sun rose, she went out to survey the damage, dreading the back-breaking labor of sawing and moving the giant tree. But when she arrived, the tree was already gone. It had been expertly sawn into manageable logs, which were neatly stacked near her woodpile. The broken fence posts had been removed and laid aside, ready for replacement. There were no footprints, no sign of who had done the work. There was only a single small hawk feather left on top of the woodpile. Another time, as winter began to sink its teeth into the land, she found a freshly killed doe lying by her back door, its throat cut cleanly. Her own supplies of smoked meat were running low, and the gift was a godsend. She knew no white hunter would leave such a prize. But the protection had another darker side. The story of Roman Fletcher's humiliation spread like wildfire, though the details were warped in the telling. Fletcher, to save face, claimed he'd been ambushed by a massive war party that Emma had been hiding in her cabin. He painted her as a traitor, a woman who consorted with savages against her own kind. When she next rode into Custer City for flour and salt, the change was palpable. The town had always been a rough place, but there had been a baseline of frontier civility. Now conversation stopped when she entered the general store. Men who had once tipped their hats now spat on the ground as she passed. The store owner, a nervous man named Silas Croft, served her quickly, his eyes downcast, refusing to meet her gaze. "That'll be $4, Mrs. Thompson," he mumbled, pushing her supplies across the counter. "Folks seem quiet today." "Silas," she said, testing the waters. He finally looked up, his eyes full of a fearful pity. "People are saying things, Emma, about you and the Sioux, about Fletcher. It ain't safe for you to be seen here." "What they're saying are lies," she said, her voice firm. "Lies or truth. It don't matter in a place like this," he whispered, leaning closer. "All that matters is what people choose to believe. And they choose to believe Fletcher. He's got money, and he buys a lot of whiskey for a lot of men. Go home, Emma. Stay there." She left the town with her head held high, but his words chilled her to the bone. She was an outcast. Her own people now saw her as the enemy. The invisible shield of the Lakota had become a wall cutting her off from the world she had once belonged to. Roman Fletcher did not return. He was too proud to risk another confrontation and too cunning to openly defy a man like Black Buffalo. Instead, he waged a war of whispers and isolation. He bought the mortgage on the land of her nearest neighbor, a farmer named MacLeod, and forced him out, leaving Emma even more alone. He spread rumors that her well was poisoned, that her land was cursed. No prospector dared to cross her property. no traveler sought shelter at her cabin. Emma Jane Thompson became a ghost story, a local legend. The Witch of the Black Hills, some called her. The woman who had traded her soul to the Sioux. She endured. Her solitude, once a source of grief, became her armor. She learned to rely on no one but herself and the silent, unseen guardians who watched from the ridges. Her garden flourished. Her aim with the shotgun became unerringly accurate. She spoke more to the ghost of her husband and the animals in her care than she did to any living human. Years passed. The Great Sioux War of 1876 erupted, bathing the territory in blood. Custer fell at the Little Bighorn. The army flooded the plains, relentless and vengeful. The Lakota were hounded, starved, and forced onto reservations. Through all the violence and turmoil, Emma's homestead remained an island of impossible peace. War parties, both Sioux and Army patrols, seemed to detour around her land, as if guided by an unseen map, where her 160 acres were marked as a different country entirely. One bitter winter evening, nearly a decade after she had healed Chayton, there was a soft knock on her door. It was the first knock she had heard in years. Cautiously, she took the shotgun and opened it to find an old Lakota man standing in the swirling snow. He was gaunt and frail, wrapped in a thin, tattered army blanket. It took her a moment to recognize the high cheekbones, the intelligent eyes. It was Chayton. He looked ancient, his body broken not by a bullet, but by defeat and despair. He told her his father, Black Buffalo, had been killed the year before, shot, while resisting being moved to the Standing Rock Agency. He told her their way of life was over, their spirit broken. He himself was on his way to the reservation, a prisoner in his own land. "I came to tell you," he said in his now proficient, heavily accented English. "The oath is ended. My father is gone. Our warriors are scattered. There is no one left to protect you." Emma looked at the man she had saved, this ghost from a past that felt like another lifetime. She brought him inside, sat him by the fire, and gave him a hot meal of stew and fresh bread, just as she had done all those years ago. "The oath was never just from your father, Chayton," she said, softly, looking at the eagle feather, which still rested on her mantle, its colors as vibrant as the day it was given. "It was a promise between two people in a dark time. It doesn't end with death. It lives right here." She touched her heart. "You are welcome in this house. This will always be a place of peace." He stayed for 2 days, resting his weary body and soul. When he left, walking east toward the reservation and his diminished future, Emma watched him go until he was a tiny speck in the snow. She was truly alone now. The magic was gone. The shield was down. Yet she felt no fear. The oath had protected her from Fletcher and the war, but her solitude had forged a strength in her that was all her own. She had survived. Emma Jane Thompson lived on that homestead for another 20 years. She never remarried, never left. The world changed around her. The territory became a state. Towns grew into cities. But on her small patch of land, time seemed to stand still. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, the eagle feather clutched in her hand. The story goes that on the day she was buried in a small plot next to her husband, a lone golden eagle was seen circling high overhead, its cry echoing through the silent hills. A final salute, perhaps, from a chief to a friend, their eternal promise finally fulfilled. The story of Emma Jane Thompson and Chief Black Buffalo isn't written in any official history book. It's a tale that lives in the whisper of the wind through the pines of the Black Hills. It's a powerful reminder that even in the most brutal of times, courage isn't always about the fastest draw or the deadliest shot. Sometimes it's about an open door, a steady hand, and the choice to see humanity in the face of an enemy. It shows us that a single act of compassion can echo through generations, and a promise made in honor is more binding than any law or treaty. If this story of the Forgotten West moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates tales of courage and conviction. And be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the dramatic, untold stories of the American frontier.